So when I was about 9 or 10, one summer day at my babysitter's house, I read a story that subtly but profoundly changed me for the rest of my life, really. Hello, comrades! Spoiler alert, because today we are talking about the 1996 five-star classic, Frindle, the book that forever changed how I view language. Part 1. What is a word? So, stupid question. Why is this a pen? Why not Bluma? Why not the Stylo? Why not the Stift? The hero of our story is a fifth grader named Nick, and our antagonist is the English teacher, Mrs. Grange. And our hero insists that this is indeed not a pen at all, but rather that it is a Frindle. But Mrs. Grange insists otherwise, that it is a pen. Mrs. Grange teaches a particular way of viewing language. She explains that the reason that, for instance, the word for dog is dog in English is because we all agree it's dog. In German, they say Hund. In Spanish, we say perro. But in English, we all agreed that dog means dog. And that if someday we all agree to start calling it something else, that new word, that something else, would be added to the dictionary, might even replace dog. The peculiar thing about how she views language is that she says that in her classroom, the dictionary is the law. She says that the laws can change. They are not eternal, but they only change when they need to. But our hero, the fifth grader named Nick, sees the contradiction. He sees that if it's based on agreement, and that the agreement happens first, if people start saying dog, and then the dictionary comes and records that that's how we say dog, well, it means that the dictionary is what is often called descriptive. He doesn't use that word, of course, but that's really kind of the fundamental philosophy there, that the dictionary is describing how we use language. So descriptive is often contrasted with prescriptive. A prescriptive view of the dictionary would be the idea that it's telling you how you should speak. It's prescribing a particular manner of speech, and if you speak in any other way, then that's wrong. If you call a dog something else, if you call it like a Foddleforth or something like that, you're incorrect. The dictionary says it's dog, gotta move on. Whereas in a descriptive view, the dictionary is simply incomplete. It hasn't described the language completely, and if you and a group of friends call a dog a Foddleforth, you're completely right, and the dictionary is just missing that information. Our hero Nick decides to run an experiment to kind of think about this. He takes a few friends, and they all agree to replace an old word with a new word. They choose to replace pen with Frindle. This is not a pen, it's a Frindle now. So, to see if it works, Nick goes to the store and asks the person behind the counter to grab a pack of Frindles. And the woman behind the counter, well, obviously she's confused. She's never heard this word, but Nick helpfully points out to the pens, the Frindles, and says he wants a black one. And so she hands him a pack of Frindles. Each day, they repeat this experiment with a different kid until the woman behind the counter is completely accustomed to the new word. Is completely accustomed to Frindle. And when you ask for a Frindle, she immediately asks if you want a blue one or black one. And I really love this example in this book because it shows how easily language can and often does change. Even just your personal usage of language, just having a few people in your environment use a new word is often enough for you to quickly become used to it. And very often without anyone explicitly telling you the meaning. They don't tell her that Frindle means pen. They just point to pens and say Frindle, and tell this is Frindle in her mind. And some people might be annoyed with certain words. Everyone has their pet peeves. But most of the time, we don't think much of these minor differences, that one person might say trousers and another person would say pants, or one person might say ain't when someone else would say don't. We can see how quickly a word can become used within a community, and within that community, it's just as a legitimate word as any other word in the dictionary. It's all just an agreement between people within those communities. Part 2. In defense of prescriptive grammar. So we're taking a very descriptive view, so we're gonna look at the prescriptive view. The group of people who use Frindle in the book grows as the word slowly takes over the school. The teacher, Mrs. Grange, is upset by this, and she attempts to ban the word. Now, at first, being upset by this new word might seem a little bit strange, but we are going to do a deep dive on prescriptive grammar to look at its faults and why it could be considered a good thing. Historically, prescriptive grammar, the idea that there is a right way of speaking and you should aspire to speak in such a manner, has been very popular, but it's slowly come under fire in modern society. First, from the very start of linguistics, it is not a branch of study that is concerned with telling people how to speak. As a scientific study, linguistics is concerned with figuring out how people do speak, in the description of how they do speak, not telling them how they are wrong. So many people, as they learn more about linguistics and hear actual linguists talk about language, they come to see how prescriptive grammar is really kind of arbitrary and often unnecessary. And honestly, this is true. It is indeed arbitrary. There is no reason that the supposedly correct way of speaking should be any way and not another way. It's just not necessary that this be a pen and not be a Frindle. You don't have to write down the rules of your native language to be able to speak it. In fact, most people don't write down the rules of their native language, and historically, that's really kind of a modern invention. I would say most people don't really even understand all of the rules very well of their native language. This comes up a lot when you're studying another language, where you'll have a question, something won't make sense to you, and you'll ask a random native speaker, and they'll be confused by it. They can tell you what's correct and what's incorrect, but they can't really give you a description of why, because it's so intuitive for them. They don't have an intellectual framework. And this happens a lot in English. A good example of this would be the order of adjectives. If I say, the quick brown fox, that's correct. But if I say, the brown quick fox, that's incorrect. Most native English speakers can agree that it's incorrect, but they can't really tell you why, they can't tell you what's going on, and they can't help out someone who's learning English. The other problem with prescriptive grammar is if a language has more than one dialect, that is, more than one way of being spoken, which is pretty much every language. I don't think there's any language that only has one dialect, unless there's only one speaker left. And if we decide that one way is correct, that decision will inevitably favor one dialect, one way of speaking, and it will favor the people who speak that dialect over any other dialect. This often has negative implications. With English, we can see this. We can see that the way that's considered best is often the way that rich people from important cities speak. So English is a multi-centric, a pluricentric language. So there's no one global standard, but we have American English and British English, for example. And so with like British English, the rich Londoner is considered to have a more proper speech, closer to received pronunciation than the poor Welsh coal miner, or even the poor person in London with a Cockney accent. In the US, what is considered correct is far removed from what you might hear in the poorest parts of Alabama or Hawaii. Favoritism in dialects in English has been the favoritism of how rich, mostly white people from certain regions speak, and telling anyone who speaks differently that they sound uneducated. So, if prescriptive grammar was so closely tied to ideas of regionalism, classism, and even sometimes racism, what could possibly be the advantage of prescriptive grammar? That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. Imagine an American newscaster and a British newscaster. They sound different, right? But they don't sound too different. Now imagine someone with a thick Southern accent from the United States and someone with a thick Scottish accent. You'll find that the difference between these two is much greater than between the two newscasters. Not only in terms of pronunciation, but also in terms of lexicon, that is, word choice and grammar. And this is because the prescriptive grammar and pronunciation between the US and UK hasn't changed all that much, mostly in pronunciation and a few words. There may be a small number of few grammatical things, and many of the changes that have occurred have often occurred in unison. For instance, replacing whom with who universally has become widespread in both the US and UK. Using prescriptive grammar can help us be understood by the largest possible audience. Using Frindle with your friends can work perfectly, but if you try to use Frindle with a wider public, they might be lost. So you might want to sound like a newscaster if you are a newscaster, if you are trying to be understood by an entire country, or maybe even people from different countries who still speak the same language. Following prescriptive grammar can be as simple as avoiding certain slang terms that might be confusing for other people who simply don't know them, like Frindle. But many people have to learn whole new dialects. They have to change a lot of words, they have to change the pronunciation, they have to change their grammar. And for these people, it is indeed harder to kind of learn what is considered the prescriptive or the normative way of speaking. But for some of them, it can be worth it still. Sometimes this leads to something called diglossia, where an entire society uses one dialect formally and different dialects informally. Or even sometimes they'll use a formal language, like a whole nother language that they use in formal context, and then when they're at home in an informal context, they use an informal language. We see this a lot in the Arab world, where people who speak Egyptian Arabic might have trouble understanding some things in Moroccan Arabic, but if they use modern standard Arabic, which they learned in school, they can communicate a lot more effectively. Another case where we can see this is in medieval Europe, where Latin was the universal language for a long time, even after all the dialects of Latin had long since evolved into different languages. So one person speaks Italian at home, another person speaks Spanish at home, but they come together at some kind of international gathering. They still speak in Latin, even though it's not the native language of anyone anymore. But at its worst, prescriptive grammar is a way of placing certain groups of people above others. And at its best, prescriptive grammar is an amazing way of connecting people across cultures and fomenting peace and communication. Part 3. Do we want to be understood by everyone? So, if changing how we talk leads to us being understood by fewer people, why do we do it? Why do we say Frindle when everyone else was saying pen? I think the simple answer is that being understood by everyone simply isn't the most important thing all the time. Speech is self-expression. Not just in terms of the literal meaning of what we say, but also in terms of how we say it. Through subtle and often not so subtle patterns, our word choice, grammar, accent, and even inflection, can kind of suggest information about who we are. Certain speech patterns are correlated to your gender, your geographic location, your class, your level of education, age, sexual orientation, race, and you might want to communicate these to indicate kind of an in-group identity. I don't think I've said anything too overtly political in this video yet, but how many of you think you could confidently predict who I voted for in the last American election, just based on my presentation and speech? I'm willing to bet that someone watching this video years in the future will be able to predict who I will have voted for in 2028, and I don't even know who will be running yet. And how much of that is just based off of how I subtly signal a self-image of who I am with my speech. So not everyone wants to talk in the so-called correct way. How many places in England do you think kids might make fun of another kid for sounding too posh? Or places in the US where a kid might get made fun of for sounding too white? I'm sure that number isn't zero. The truth is, we speak to tell the world who we are. And so that's why I think a lot of times you'll see this with place names. A lot of times, if you're from a place, there will be a certain way of pronouncing that city. And people who are from away don't pronounce it correctly. So it's this really kind of, even that, it's this really small signaling of, I'm from this place, I know the local pronunciation. And I think that's why children always find new slang. Children strive to create their own identity, separate themselves from their parents, so they can't speak exactly like their parents. If their parents say pen, one way to be different from their parents is to say Frindle. Part 3. The eternal slang treadmill. People often talk about the euphemism treadmill, the idea that we have words with certain marginalized groups that become seen as increasingly negative until, in an attempt to treat people better, we come up with a new word to describe those people. The problem is that unless the underlying prejudice within society has changed, the process will repeat itself. We can look at some examples. First we had invalid, then we had cripple, then handicapped, and now we have disabled. And each one was considered the correct term at a certain period of time. The problem often isn't the word itself. Maybe invalid was always a problem, but the deeper problem is often society and how society itself treats, in this case, disabled people. It's problematic. If they view disabled people very negatively, they're going to use bad words for them, and the words for them, for disabled people, will become negative. And so those words, whatever those words may be, can become problematic too. And the same thing happens with slang. The younger generation is always seeking to form a new identity with new words. But once words become established, they are no longer new. So in the book, the word Frindle takes over the school and eventually the state and becomes widely used in the entire country, and is finally added to the dictionary. And Mrs. Grange reveals that she had been secretly supporting the word for much of the book. She knew that by being aggressively against Frindle, she would cement it as something cool in the minds of the students, ultimately propelling its popularity. But once it's in the dictionary, once Frindle is in the dictionary, it's no longer cool. It's no longer new. It's just another part of our language. Its own success destroys its very purpose, and it becomes bland and invisible, just as the word pen before it was. In her initial attempt to stamp out the word, Mrs. Grange explains that the word Frindle isn't just a new word, it's an attack on an old word. For her, in her way of viewing the language, pen wasn't just bland and invisible. And this is a part I always remember since I read it first when I was a kid. Even before I reread it as an adult, Mrs. Grange explains that the word pen comes from the Latin word penna, meaning feather, because quills were some of the first writing instruments and were made of feathers. Maybe it's just because a few years later I started learning Spanish, and in Spanish we do the same thing, where pluma can mean pen, but it also literally means feather, at least in certain countries. I think like in Spain they say like boligrafo, but I always say pluma. But I always remembered this. I always remembered this etymology. I thought it was really cool. It's cool to know the history of our words and how they stretch back in time, in understanding it. I think there is a value to learning antiquated language, studying early modern and middle English to see how English got here. Maybe even Old English, or French or Latin. But I see it as part of an endless treadmill of change. Every generation changes our beautiful language a little bit. And it's not just English, it happens in every language. Little by little, word by word, sometimes even sound by sound, we change how we speak. I often think about how every now and again, my grandma would use a word that I hadn't heard before, or it was a word that I knew before, but with a slightly different meaning. She would use different phrases and, those kind of old-timey sayings. And I think about how it would have happened even more with her parents, if I'd ever known my great-grandparents, and even more with their parents. And I wonder just how far back I would have to go before that balance between the search for self-identity and agreed-upon communication would break down, and I would no longer be able to understand the speech of my ancestors. So we're going to do something a little different. There's a beautiful Galician poem I always return to, and I'm going to read it. Stick with me, I'm going to read it in Galician and then an English translation. You can stick with me for a second and listen to me read it in Galician, or skip ahead to my English translation. This is from Folhas Novas by Rosalio Castro, the wonderful Galician poet. Bem, sé que nunca hay nada novo embaixo do céu. Quantas outras pensaram, as coisas que ora eu penso. E bem, para que escrevo? E bem, porque dizemos, reloj, que repetimos eternamente o mesmo. Well, I know that there is nothing new below the heavens, that before others thought, the things I now think. And well, what do I write for? And well, why are we like this? Clocks that repeat eternally. I love this poem for so many reasons, but I love it so much because of the language it was written in, a small regional language of Spain, Galician. Why do we write when everything has already been said before? I can't but notice we always say what has already been said in a new language, in new words. The rules of language change, not because they must, but because we are always demanding new words to express who we are. As beautiful as the history of language is, the most beautiful part is the drive to always change it. So go out there and speak differently. Today we may call this a Frindle, but know that when we are gone, our descendants will do whatever they wish with the language they inherit. Find the beauty in the change, because there is no language without change, just as there is no river without flow. So, this is a kid's book. There were no words I had to look up, which is probably a good thing. If I had to look up words, it would probably be a little too challenging for kids. Besides the word pen, I looked up the word pen to verify the etymology. The etymology in the book is correct, so that's cool. So instead of going over the words I had to look up to read this book, we're going to be talking about cool words which were invented or have an unknown etymology, but are still perfectly cromulent. First up, we have blatant. This was coined by Edmund Spenser to describe a beast, a blatant beast, which means that in older uses, because it was a little unclear, it could mean kind of terrible until it kind of fell into its modern usage of very blunt. I think probably this was affected by the fact that blunt and blatant kind of sound similar. So, it's like a blatant, it's very explicit, it's very blunt, it's, not trying to hide itself. Next up, we have portmanteau, a name for a blend word, which was coined by Lewis Carroll to describe the words in his poem Jabberwocky that combine the beginning of one word with the end of another word, or sometimes even more complex blendings. Famous examples are brunch or spork, but Lewis Carroll's own chortle, a combination of snort and chuckle, has also reached a certain level of popular acceptance. And I think it's important to note that the original use of portmanteau was a kind of luggage that opened in two compartments. While not originally a blend word, portmanteau is a compound word in French made of port, to carry, and manteau, which is a coat. It is a thing you can use to carry a coat. It's a coat carrier. Next up, we have Shakespeare, who's famous for having invented, or at the very least, provided the first attestation of thousands of words. Going back so far, it's a little hard to tell which words he coined and how much of it's just it's now a language that had been written down. It was adding a lot of vocabulary, and he just happened to be the first person who wrote it down in a text that we still have. But today we'll take our example of one of his coined words, which is Jessica. It's a name he invented, possibly inspired by a Hebrew word, and he used it for a character in The Merchant of Venice, possibly because he simply didn't know what any actual Jewish names were. And finally, we have dog, the word that got us started in this entire linguistic adventure in the first place. Normally in English, we have words of Germanic origin that are similar to other Germanic languages, like German or Norwegian, or we have words from French or Latin, which tend to be words which are similar to other Romance languages. And we often have roots from both places to describe the same or similar things. With dog, we have the word canine from Latin, and we have the word hound, which is a Germanic root. But although it comes from an Old English word, we have no idea where the word dog actually comes from. All that is to say that we are constantly inventing new words for things without a name. We're inventing new things to have words for. And even if we do have a perfectly good word for something, it doesn't mean that we can't or won't replace it with a completely different word for whatever reason we see fit. This is a 5-star classic. For me, it has a special place in my heart, at least. And if there is any child in your life who you think may enjoy it, or if you yourself are curious, I would recommend it. If you'd like to talk about flowers for Algernon and ableism, you can do that over here. And if you'd like to stick around for my upcoming video about The Great Gatsby, right here. Maybe another book, if if I get bored of this book, if I decide I actually I didn't like it as a teenager and that was a well-founded opinion, I just don't feel like finish it and decide to read something else, I might do a video about a different book. Or if you want to stick around for my upcoming video about the word thou and Shakespearean English, more of the history of English in this kind of linguistic perspective, then you should subscribe to my channel. But don't forget to give me a like before you go. Now, good night, good day, good potato.